and the need to guard against sanctions and war fatigue. I also want to thank you for delivering this really important message here at Georgetown, an institution that has a very long track record of training those dedicated to the practice and the law of foreign policy, and under the auspices of our Institute of International Economic Law, which was founded by the late Professor John Jackson, who, among many other things, provided a lot of the intellectual underpinning for a rules-based trading system and was a constant and persistent defender of international economic institutions. So really thank you. I want to start, maybe if I could, with one of what I think is the big takeaways from your remarks, which is that we may be headed back in the direction of a kind of a Cold War with countries like Russia, frozen out of the global economic system. I mean, for me, if I look back over the last 20 years, it seems that the United States and Europe and some of our allies pursued the idea that by tying ourselves economically to some of our adversaries, including Russia, including China, that we could prevent great power conflicts, that we could turn those countries toward openness, towards free markets, even nudging them towards democracy. And yet we've seen Putin invade Ukraine despite all of the pledges by the Western world not to do that, in violation of that absolute most fundamental principle of international law, that you cannot change borders through the use of force. We've seen China under Xi Jinping crush democracy and free press in Hong Kong, take more military actions with respect to Taiwan, again, enter into its no limits partnership with Russia. So, I mean, you mentioned that you and those in the 8 European Union countries that had lived under Soviet rule were not surprised. I guess my question to you is, why were all the rest of us surprised? Why did we not hear this message of what was going on? What went wrong? What did the institutions that were designed to stop this fail? And what should we make of these lessons that you've so clearly laid out?
That's of course a very good question. What went wrong and why we ended where we ended up? I think there may be a bit of a combination of wishful thinking and just plain business interests. So it's clear that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a thinking that countries will be transitioning towards democracy, including Russia. There was willingness to engage with Russia, and that was all understandable and to the extent even working in 1990s. But things gradually have started to change with Putin's ascent to the power, because it must be said that immediately one could see that you have a different kind of leader at the head of Russia, because one of the first things Putin was doing, he was cracking down on media freedom. That was really the first thing he was doing, and in a sense, this direction towards authoritarianism was very clear. And gradually, also, he and Russia became more kind of confrontational in its rhetorics towards the West, with the rhetoric of the collapse of Soviet Union being the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. But there were many people who were kind of willing to cooperate, willing maybe to ignore some negative signals. Clearly, there were business interests. Russia was a significant market for a number of companies, including European companies. Russia was a significant supplier of hydrocarbons, energy resources. So clearly, there was also economic case to engage with Russia. So those warning signals basically went unnoticed, and they were accumulating. And in a problem that the absence of proper Western reaction was just facilitating further steps. So when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, taking away parts of its territory, hardly anything was done. Some very timid sanctions, but what's close to nothing. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and invaded part of the Donbass, also, okay, some sanctions were introduced, also some export controls were introduced. Now we are learning a lot how they were actually circumvented, and Western companies supplying prohibited goods and arms and other things to Russia. So something was done, but clearly not enough to build up this pressure. I remember after the time, after Russia's invasion in Crimea, Russians were kind of laughing about Western sanctions, saying, okay, so what do we have after the first set of sanctions? So on the positive, we have Crimea. On the negative, a dozen of people will not be able to go for a West for a couple of years. Okay, on a balance, it makes sense to continue. It, in a sense, encouraged this Putin's and Russia's aggressive behavior when they saw that their kind of aggressive behavior, invading neighboring countries, also meddling in political processes in neighboring countries, in EU countries, even in the United States, that it all is not really meeting the firm response. So they allowed also themselves to move into this narrative. Okay, West is weak, West is decaying, West is fading power, so we can do whatever it wants. Okay, now one can look back and think what could have and should have been doing differently. But what is important right now is what we are doing now, how we are responding now, and there it must be said that now the West response is clear and strong, and it's important that it stays this way, and it stays this way as long as needed.
If I can follow up a little bit on that, I mean, I do think it is very clear to everyone that this is very different. The sanctions were both far more comprehensive, far deeper, far faster in their application. But on the flip side, if you look at who is engaging in the sanctions, what you do not see is any countries in Central or Latin America imposing sanctions, any countries in Africa, any countries in the Middle East, any countries in South Asia, any countries in Southeast Asia. Should we be concerned that this looks like a very Euro-US West sort of development without the rest of the world joining in this effort? And we're going to end up with a very sort of bipolar world in terms of those that are in the bloc that impose sanctions and those that are not?
Yes, it's a valid observation. Of course, there are also countries from other regions who are engaging, who are imposing sanctions, including Japan, including South Korea, including Australia, just to mention some countries. But it's clear that there are so many countries who are not engaging in this effort, and probably the country which makes most difference in this regard is China. So we recently had a EU-China summit where we were discussing a lot about these topics. And it's clear that China is kind of maneuvering. Indeed, you mentioned this Xi Jinping's rhetoric that friendship between China and Russia knows no borders or no limits. But in reality, we see that there are quite a limit. So on one hand, one can say, okay, China is not really engaging with the West, but it's also not really engaging with Russia. It seems to be hedging its bets and probably seeking maximum benefit from itself in this situation. So that's why I was mentioning also in my speech that it's important that we are not only working with like-minded partners, because like-minded partners are already on board. We're already applying sanctions, we're already putting pressure, we're already supporting Ukraine. But we need to work with a wider global community, indeed, to avoid the situation where, with few exceptions, indeed, it's kind of a Western world which is responding.
So I wonder if I could then turn. I mean, obviously, the clear thrust of your remarks is to stress the importance of shoring up the transatlantic alliance. And there, the area where we've seen, I would argue, the most progress and where there appears to be so much promise ahead is the Trade and Technology Council, with all of its working groups, covering such a wide array of issues. I'm just curious, from your sense, where do you think this effort is headed and when? I mean, are we likely to see formal agreements coming out of it on issues like mutual recognition of standards or adoption of common standards, coordinated approaches to export controls? What role have you seen the TTC playing in coordinating sanctions on Russia?
Yeah, okay, let's be clear. TTC is, in a sense, forward-looking coordination framework, which allows us to work on a number of policy areas across different sectors of technologies, like semiconductors, like artificial intelligence, like many sectors of trade, like supply chains resilience, like export controls, investment screening, global trade challenges. So it's a forward-looking cooperation framework. So this is not a primary framework where we are dealing with Russian sanctions. Dedicated, in a sense, work streams which are dealing and coordinating specifically Russia's sanctions. But it must be said that also Trade and Technology Council helped in this regard, because as I was mentioning, one of the work streams is export controls. And the very fact that our experts were already working together, starting to coordinate our export control approach, addressing some of the differences and difficulties we had with each other approaches, it helped to build trust, and it helped in this way to be able to act in a fast and determined way. And by now one can say that we managed to jointly to limit Russia's access at least to half of the technologies which they are needing, and it's already now, it's not such a long time, starts being felt across different sectors of Russian industry, including military industry. So the fact that we were working on these issues in a cooperative way helped us to move fast on sanctions. So in terms of concrete results, well, actually, yesterday I had meetings both with Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai to discuss, amongst other things, our preparations for Trade and Technology Council. Indeed, we will definitely be working how we can better strengthen our coordination on export controls. Another topic I also briefly mentioned is the question of mitigating supply chain disruptions which are coming from the war, diversifying our supplies. There, I think it's important that we're also, in a sense, cooperating and comparing our approaches, how to best diversify away from Russia. On mutual recognition, indeed, is one of the areas where we are hoping to have some first concrete results. So the work is ongoing, and we look for a good outcome in the TDC, which is in mid-May in Paris.
Fantastic. One of the other areas of U.S.-EU cooperation, and one I guess that I find particularly intriguing, is the idea of putting together a green steel and green aluminum deal between the United States and the EU. As I understand it, the idea being that the U.S. and the European Union would restrict access to their markets for non-participants in this arrangement that either do not meet the standards of low carbon intensity or do not meet conditions of market orientation and contribute to non-market excess capacity. I mean, I just would love to hear your thoughts on what the EU hopes to achieve with this agreement.
Yeah, okay. For this agreement, one needs to know a little bit prehistory, how this agreement came being, because in a sense, we had major issues when Trump administration imposed tariffs, so-called Section 232 tariffs on EU steel and aluminum. So we had been dealing with this topic with the Trump administration, not very successfully. We were imposing some, in a sense, contra tariffs against the United States as a response to their tariffs. But clearly it was a major trade irritant. So when a Biden administration came into office, we were reaching out to each other to resolve this problem. And why there is a problem, especially in the steel sector, because there is a global overcapacity. And there is also a global forum to address this overcapacity, but frankly, it's not delivering very efficient results. So clearly, we need to see how we address this question of global overcapacity. So instead of fighting each other, how we are systemically addressing this issue. And that's how, in a sense, we reached interim solution on these two steel and aluminum tariffs. So on one hand, we agreed to the solution where US is replacing their tariffs with tariff rate quotas, at least respecting the historical trade volumes, which are entering US tariff free. But from the EU, it's very clear that we see end destination of this work, complete normalization of trade, complete lifting of those 232 also tariff rate quotas. So those are two parallel processes. Basically, the idea was, in order to finalize this work, we need to address this global issue. And that's where the global steel and aluminum arrangement comes in, dealing, as you rightly noted, on greening the industry and addressing global overcapacity and non-market practices. And we have quite ambitious timeline. Normally, it should enter into force by October next year. So we'll be working very intensively now in the coming months to make it a reality.
And obviously, for many, the intriguing part of it, in part, was not necessarily just the trade side of it, the need to resolve the 232 tariffs, but this idea of how are you going to measure low carbon intensity? What are you going to do to any steel or aluminum that might be exported into either of those markets that does not meet that criteria? Could you tell a little bit more? How do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, well, these are exactly the issues we are currently looking how to best address. Well, in the EU, we have already certain tools at our disposal. For example, carbon border adjustment mechanism. We know that's not necessarily direction where US is looking, but then we need to see how we align our approaches in a sense without creating new difficulties between us. But to elaborate a bit on this carbon border adjustment mechanism, idea is the following. That currently we are allocating free CO2 emissions to energy intensive industries, basically to avoid carbon leakage. Because if you start putting price on carbon, then industry may just relocate and we will end up importing still polluting steel or cement or whatever. So not reducing global emissions, but just destroying our industry. So, but since we now have European Green Deal, we have decided to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and to reach 55% emission reductions already by 2030. So it's clear that we cannot continue with free emissions for energy intensive industry. So we need to put price on carbon and that's what we'll be doing. But then we need to address carbon leakage by other means. So what we are saying is that we are putting price on carbon. And any importers which are importing also must pay the same price of carbon, which means that if the third country is also having its emission trading scheme or something similar, pricing the carbon, it will be factored in. So in ideal scenario, when another country has exactly the same system and carbon price as the EU, no CBAM is to be paid. If there is a difference, this difference needs to be paid. So basically to ensure the level playing field between European industry and importers. And we were very careful to make sure that it's WTO compatible. And the key word there is non-discrimination. So we are treating our domestic producers and importers the same way. Both will effectively will have to pay the same price for carbon.
And do you see this green steel and aluminum deal as being exactly the same as the CBAM, or would it require something different with respect to steel and aluminum?
Well, I would say it's unlikely going to be exactly the CBAM because from our context with U.S. administration, it's clear that U.S. administration is not looking so much in the direction of pricing carbon, but rather on set of regulatory measures and maybe some incentives how to reduce the emissions. So that will be one of the tasks of this global steel arrangements to see how we reconcile those different approaches.
All right. I'm going to ask maybe one last question before we open it up to the audience. So I would urge all of you out there to think about the questions that you would want to pose. The last one I want to turn to is the WTO. Obviously, the WTO is scheduled to hold its long postponed ministerial meeting during the week of June 13th. I think many view this as a very crucial meeting for the organization, given the various malaises at the WTO, whether it's the demise of the appellate body, the failure to reach really any significant new agreements other than the trade facilitation agreement, the real pressing need to come to an agreement on how do we limit subsidies for fisheries before we all overfish all of the fish out of the ocean. The concerns about whether the sort of core raison d'etre of the WTO remains where it should be. I mean, a heavy focus on non-discrimination when many see that the WTO really needs to start addressing how to fight climate change, how to join the fight against COVID, how to think seriously about development, how do we work on issues of inequality, a lot of things that are now being laid at the feet of the WTO. And at the same time, a lot of concern that that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made any meetings in which Russia is perceived to be there in the negotiations almost impossible for a number of members of the WTO. And yet others take the view that, it's an institution that's bedrock principles, non-discrimination. If Russia is a member, Russia has a right to be at the table. And you have these very competing views over how to approach it. And as you noted, the WTO has no procedure or rules to simply kick Russia out of the WTO. That does not exist in the current rule book. How do you see this ministerial going forward at all in some ways? And if you then step back from it, what would success look like for this particular ministerial?
Indeed, you described all the complexity which we are facing ahead of the WTO ministerial. So I'll outline a bit what we would see as a successful outcome, or realistically successful outcome. It's clear that WTO needs to be able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemics. So the question on the agreement on trade and health, carrying different aspects, including the question of how to improve the global access to COVID vaccines, diagnostics and therapeutics, how to avoid export restrictions and export bans, especially in cases of pandemics, how to ensure the transparency, also how to properly address intellectual property issues. We have been working very intensively in quadrilateral format, European Union, with the United States, with India, with South Africa on this particular topic. So the first block is trade and health. Then I would say now there is a new urgency which needs to be addressed, which is food accessibility as a consequence of Russia-Ukraine war, because Russia is the world's biggest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is the fifth biggest exporter of wheat. There are many countries which are dependent on Ukrainian supplies, and currently Russia is deliberately destroying the grain storages in Ukraine. It's blocking Ukrainian ports, so they cannot really export their wheat. So, and we're already seeing food prices going up, volatility in food commodities markets. So something also I think World Trade Organization needs to address, also among other things, avoiding undue export restrictions, which normally only tend to worsen the situation, and especially worsen the situation for least developed countries. So, so we need a coordinated response to the global food security challenges caused by the war. Well, you mentioned agreement on fisheries subsidies. That's a bit strange process, because several times there was a feeling, okay, we are just at the brink of agreeing, and somehow it's always evading. So maybe we'll be able to finally nail it down in MC12. Okay, it's still issues which are unresolved, but that could be a positive outcome. Definitely you mentioned the institutional reform itself, and we think that WTO needs reform across all its core functions, negotiation, monitoring and deliberation, dispute settlement. We have already more than a year ago come with a detailed WTO reform proposal from the European Union. So what we would see as a realistic outcome is to set up a WTO working group, which would start working on all those aspects with the aim of reaching outcomes by MC13.
So what do you need from the United States in order to get to that successful vision of a ministerial?
It's clearly, none of this will happen without engagement of the United States. So what we need is engagement and constructive cooperative approach. And it must be said that if we compare with the Trump administration years, clearly we see much more willingness and openness to engage, to work in international institutions, including WTO. Well, we know that there are some kind of difficulties in US, which are like bipartisan difficulties concerning the functioning of the appellate body. Actually, the blockage of the nominations for appellate body did not start with Trump administration; it started with Obama administration. So, so there are some issues which we'll clearly need to discuss and see how U.S. concerns can be addressed. But basically, we just need engagement and constructive spirit and willingness to reach agreements.
Fantastic. All right, I'd now like to open it up to our audience for questions. Over here, in the front.
And please briefly introduce yourself.
If you could please introduce yourself and then present a question.
Sure. I'm Allison Redding. I'm a 2L JD student here at Georgetown. Thank you so much for coming. My question is, what other goals do you have for the transatlantic relationship in the next 2 years, apart from the crisis management aspect?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So a part of crisis management aspects, well, we were talking already a lot about Trade and Technology Council, because that's really not about crisis management. That's a forward-looking format, how we can be in the lead of setting rules and standards for new and emerging technologies, and how we can cooperate together based on our shared democratic approaches and values. So that is definitely one area. that we need to cooperate in a good, positive, forward-looking way. Clearly, we need to maintain and develop our trade and investment relationship. Our trade and investment relationship is the largest in the world. Our trade turnover is over €1 trillion every year. So it's a major engine for economic growth and prosperity. We need to clearly cooperate on this. And we need to cooperate providing leadership to global challenges, including climate change. So now leaving apart the geopolitical problems which we are facing.
Okay, over here.
Peter Rashish from the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Mr. Executive Vice President, what lesson, if any, do you think that the United States and European Union should draw from Russia's invasion of Ukraine for their approach to China's role in the global economy? And in that respect, do you think it's the similarities between China and Russia that are most important, or the differences in how the US and the EU should look at China?
Yes, it must be said that we are having a very complicated and complex relations with China, and goes for the EU and goes for US. So how we have formulated it in the EU, that we see China as cooperation partner in some areas, as economic competitor in others, and as a strategic rival yet in others. For example, when we discuss climate change, clearly we need to cooperate with China. China is the world's biggest emitter, so if we will not have China on board, we will not achieve a meaningful outcome. When we discuss many China's economic practices concerning the role of state-owned enterprises and their competitive neutrality, concerning the forced technology transfers, concerning intellectual property rights, concerning the industrial subsidies and transparency of industrial subsidies, it's clear that we need to work to re-establish a level playing field through multilateral tools like WTO, but also through bilateral cooperation between EU and US, also trilateral cooperation, EU, US, Japan. And China is also a strategic rival, which is promoting a different socioeconomic model. So, and I would say we, broadly speaking, maybe US is describing it in a different terms, but we, broadly speaking, share the concerns, we share the diagnosis. So it's clear that we need to seek answers to this complex relations, and especially in current very complicated geopolitical situation. I think it's important that we are seeking ways how to engage with China, how to ensure that they are not really forming some kind of Russia-China alliance, because currently it's not the case. And we see that China is, in a sense, maneuvering and trying to find its own way in this situation. So we should be working to nudge them to the extent possible on our side.
We have one question also from our virtual audience, which very much goes in line with Peter's question. So I might read that out as a follow-up question. We have it from Wendy Cutler from the Asia Institute, who is asking how, if at all, does the invasion of Ukraine impact the European Union's relationship to China, or positioning towards China? Does that make it more urgent, more likely to work together with China, less likely? Does it impact it at all?
I was mentioning that we had already, after the Russia's invasion, we had EU-China summit where we were trying to discuss all those issues. Well, as you know, it was a difficult summit. Maybe there were questions which were left unresolved or unanswered. So clearly, further work will be needed. We agreed to work towards establishing our high-level trade and economic dialogues to have some engagement there, because we are seeing that also there are certain problems piling up on the trade side. So I would say it has not fundamentally changed our approach to China, but it's clearly emphasizes the need to seek ways how we can cooperate China, and as I said, how we can nudge them more on our side.
Well, on that note, I think we have reached the end of our hour. I think this is a conversation that could have gone on and on. As I know, I would have had many more questions, but we really thank you, really for the very eloquent of the European Union, of the statement of hope for transatlantic alliances getting ever stronger and deeper. I think that is clearly the message that I would take away from this. And I would simply like to thank first Marie Kasparek and those here at the Institute of International Economic Law for their work to put together this event, to all of your colleagues at the European Commission offices here in Washington for their thanks, our thanks for all the help in coordinating this. And most of all, thank you. It's been a wonderful discussion, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
There are lots of coffee and good